Well, hello everybody. My name is Jason DeCosta, and thank you for joining me on my show today called Consistent Preterism. Today is another very quick little tidbit of information or a little bit of material for you to chew on and think about. And the title of this audio is very simple. How are you redeemed? And that's a question that I don't think people give enough thought to in terms of, those who actually study the Bible under the proper fulfilled context. I'm not talking about futurists, because if you're a futurist and if you reject and ignore every single solitary time statement and every single word straight out of the mouth of Jesus that said all the things that he predicted were literally at the cusp or at the brink of taking place, then you are A, very confused, B, totally lost, and C, you have every right to believe that you're redeemed, because under that context, under that paradigm, nothing has taken place, right? Everything's still in the future. The coming, the resurrection, the judgment, the saints inheriting the kingdom, it's all still future. So they ignore everything that Christ said. They don't pay attention to any time statements, and they think that every single thing that the Bible speaks of in the New Testament last days was about us today and had nothing to do with the people to whom it was both spoken to and written to. So if you're a futurist, then by all means, have at it. You have every right to think that you're redeemed. But if you are a preterist, or if you believe in fulfilled eschatology, and if you hold the proper understanding that all these things were about to take place, just like Jesus said and Paul said and Peter said and everybody said, then you, and also I should say, if you believe that that correlates and ties in with the final destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple and the end of the Jewish age, which it clearly did, then you have no excuse. You have no excuse to think that you are redeemed today, because you cannot be. And the one place that I'm going to point to today is Revelation chapter 14. And I have done audios, maybe one or two on this passage in the past, months back, and it was very well received and all, but I wanted to sort of pose the question, how are you redeemed, for this audio, and tie it in with that same passage, because it's such a powerful point. Jeremiah, who is also a proponent of the truth of Israel only, has been holding, I guess, Don K. Preston to the flame on this point. And Don K. Preston refuses to answer it. But it is such a valid and important point. And his question to Don has been, how are you redeemed today? Right? And let's just read Revelation 14, verses 1 to 5, and you'll see exactly what he and I are speaking about. It says in verse 1, "Then I looked, and behold, a Lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his Father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven, like the voice of many waters, and like the voice of loud thunder. And I heard the sound of harpists playing their harps. And they sang, as it were, a new song before the throne, before the four living creatures and the elders. And no one could learn that song except for the 144,000 who were redeemed from the earth. These are the ones who were not defiled with women, for they are virgins. These are the ones who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These were redeemed from among men, being firstfruits to God and to the Lamb. And in their mouth was found no deceit, for they are without fault before the throne of God." So this final picture in Revelation 14 is one of redemption. It's one of inheritance. It's one of them in their promise. It's one of them in heaven, standing before the throne, having finally inherited the promise that was for them, having finally inherited the redemption and the salvation and everything that the New Testament is dealing with in those last days. Here they are, having finally received it. Right? They're in heaven. They're standing before the throne. They're singing. It sounds like the voice of many rushing waters. There was harps playing. There's music playing, and they're crying out this redemption song. And it says here very plainly and very clearly that they were the only ones who could learn that redemption song. They were the ones redeemed from the earth. So now you can spin and twist and do a little jiggy all you want and try to get out of that. But that is a chokehold headlock that is unbeatable. The only people who could be redeemed from the earth were the 144,000. The only people who could learn that redemption song, because they were the only ones redeemed, were the 144,000. And nobody has to tell you who that group was, right? That's the 12 tribes of Israel scattered abroad. That is the 12 tribes of Israel. 12,000 from each tribe, symbolically, of course. But that is exactly who they are. Just go read Revelation chapter 7, verses 1 to 8. 144,000 is the 12 tribes of Israel. And here in Revelation 14, it says that they were the only ones redeemed from the earth. And they were first fruits to God from men. And no, first fruits doesn't mean they were the first in line, as in more fruits were to come. First fruits means the chosen, the choice, the best, the ones prepared for God, the portion that belonged to God. And that's exactly what this story is all about. So they were the chosen ones, and they were God's. They were delivered to God for his possession. So when you ask these people today, how are you redeemed? It's a very valid question, and that is why Don K. Preston won't answer Jerry. The reason is because he knows what kind of hold he's in, so he has to ignore it. He has to avoid it. If only the 144,000 were redeemed from the earth, then that means only the Israelites were receiving redemption. And that means that every single person that you see saved in those last days was an Israelite. They were part of the 12 tribes, scattered abroad. Like James said, like Peter said, they were all over. They were all over. And I was listening to an interesting teaching recently from a professor in Jewish studies and history, and he was just talking about how, by the time of, the Greek period, around maybe 250 BC, there were populations of Israelites or Jews living all throughout the known world, right? They were all over the place. They were in Asia. They were all over. All the surrounding nations surrounding Israel, or surrounding Judea, I should say, they were everywhere. They had moved. They had dispersed. And many of them gave up their practices. They gave up the law. They gave up, circumcision. They gave up observing the Sabbath. And they were all around in all these nations, right? And it makes perfect sense that the Jews living in Judea, who were taking the law seriously and really practicing it and abiding by it, point by point, or at least, claiming they did, I should say, would consider these ones really a separate entity. They would consider them pagan. They would consider them dirty. They would consider them Gentile. They would consider them the dispersion. They would, like John chapter 7 says, when Jesus says he has to go, the Jews look and say, does he intend to go to the dispersion amongst the Gentiles and teach them? In other words, they knew that they were out there, and this was the mission. He was seeking his sheep both near and far. So it was just interesting to see that. I think one of the statistics that this guy threw out was that by the time of 250 BC, in some surrounding countries, the population of Jews that were living in those countries was roughly 1/3 of the population, due to the mass dispersions that were taking place. So 1/3 of the populations of these surrounding countries were already Jews, right? And then now that's 250 BC. Fast forward a couple hundred years, 250 years or 275 years, whatever it was, to the time of Christ. And you can imagine how many Jews there were at that time. We're probably talking half the population. So imagine the gospel mission going to these places such as Athens or wherever it was, and there being Jews everywhere or Israelites everywhere, right? Because they had dispersed there and they had bloomed and blossomed into extraordinary numbers. And this is why I think we see that there was a great multitude from all nations, which was the 12 tribes, brought in at the end, and that's who John sees, having been brought in from all nations, because they had, moved out to all these nations, and they existed there in great numbers. So it's just kind of fascinating that people can still say that they're redeemed, yet the Bible says that only the 144,000 were redeemed. So no one's redeemed today if the 144,000 were the only ones redeemed from the earth. That's the whole point. And that's why Jesus said that the gospel would go to all nations before his coming, and then the end would come. Because all those ones out in the nations had to be gathered in, sealed, saved, and redeemed before the end. That was the whole point. That's why the gospel was urgent, and that's why it was temporary. And of course, that ties in wonderfully with Paul's statement in Romans 11 when he says the fullness of the Gentiles shall come in, and in this way all Israel will be saved. And it would be at that time that Jacob's Redeemer would come out of Zion and turn away ungodliness from Jacob. Romans 11, 25 to 27. The fullness of the Gentiles coming in by the coming of the Lord matches the fullness of the nations getting the gospel by the coming of the Lord, which Jesus said in Matthew 24:14. So it's really an open and shut case. There is no gospel today. There is no redemption today. There's no need for redemption today because we were never under the curse. Kind of makes sense now that you understand why there's been no word from God, no revelation, no scriptures, no prophets, nothing since the end of the Jewish age. Because that's what this whole story was about. And every last one who needed that salvation received it in full by the coming of Jacob's Redeemer. Anyways, that's all I have for you today, folks. I hope you enjoyed it. Give it a like if you did, and we'll be back another day, another time, another place, and another rhyme. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.